Bus driver forces black woman to sit at the back. 3 minutes later, karma strikes. The number 47 bus rolled to a stop on Maple Avenue, its brakes issuing a tired squeal that seemed to echo Alina Jackson's own exhaustion. At 63, Alina's knees protested every step up into the vehicle, a daily reminder of years spent on her feet as a hospital nurse. Today, like most days, she carried herself with quiet dignity, her salt and pepper hair pulled back in a neat bun, her nurse's scrubs hidden beneath a weathered burgundy coat that had seen her through 15 winters. In her right hand, she clutched a worn leather satchel containing half-finished crossword puzzles, reading glasses that needed replacing, and a turkey sandwich wrapped in wax paper, lunch for her 10-hour shift. "Morning, Frank," Alina said, fishing her transit pass from her purse. The bus driver, a heavy-set man with thinning gray hair and permanent frown lines etched around his mouth, barely glanced up. "Back of the bus," Frank Mercer muttered, not bothering to check her pass. "We're running behind." Alina blinked, momentarily confused. The front section of the bus was nearly empty, with at least 7 vacant priority seats designated for seniors and those with disabilities. She'd been riding this route for over a decade and never once had Frank, or any driver, directed her where to sit. "I'm sorry," Alina said, thinking perhaps she'd misheard. Frank's grip tightened on the steering wheel, knuckles whitening. "I said move to the back. Can't you hear?" His voice carried through the bus, causing several passengers to look up from their phones and newspapers. Alina felt her cheeks warm with embarrassment and something else, a familiar, weary anger that had accompanied her through a lifetime of similar moments. She'd grown up in Birmingham, Alabama, and at 8 years old had marched alongside her parents in 1968. The words "back of the bus" carried weight that Frank, whether through ignorance or malice, had just dropped carelessly at her feet. "There are plenty of seats available right here," Alina said quietly, gesturing to the empty priority section. "And according to the transit rules, these seats are for—" "I know the rules," Frank snapped, cutting her off. "And I'm telling you to move to the back. I need these front seats clear for the church group getting on at Westfield." The bus hummed beneath them, idling at the stop while this exchange unfolded. A young woman with bright blue hair and multiple piercings looked up from her phone, eyes widening as she registered what was happening. Across the aisle, an elderly white man with a veteran's cap frowned deeply, his weathered hands tensing on the handle of his cane. Alina stood her ground, decades of similar indignities crystallizing into a moment of quiet resolve. "No, Frank, I won't be moving to the back of the bus today." The silence that followed seemed to stretch into infinity. Alina was acutely aware of her heartbeat, the weight of her bag, the eyes of other passengers. She'd faced down racist patients, condescending doctors, and hospital administrators who'd overlooked her for promotions throughout her 40-year nursing career. But this, being told to surrender her rightful place on public transportation, struck a particular nerve that connected present to past with painful clarity. Frank's face darkened. "Listen, I don't have time for this. Either move to the back or get off my bus." "Your bus?" Alina raised an eyebrow. "I wasn't aware Central Metro had sold their fleet to you personally." A few passengers chuckled nervously. Frank's face flushed crimson. "That's it," he growled, reaching for the radio handset. "I'm calling dispatch." As he picked up the handset, his attention was momentarily diverted by movement outside the bus. A man in a tailored charcoal suit was rushing toward the stop, briefcase in hand, clearly hoping to catch the bus before it departed. Frank glared at Alina one last time before returning the handset to its cradle. "This isn't over," he muttered, then opened the doors for the newcomer. The man who boarded was in his early 50s, with close-cropped salt and pepper hair and wire-rimmed glasses. He carried himself with the easy confidence of someone accustomed to authority, though his slightly disheveled appearance, tie askew, a light sheen of perspiration on his brow, suggested he'd been rushing. "Morning," he said, swiping his transit card. "Thanks for waiting." Only then did he seem to register the tension on the bus. His eyes moved from Frank's flushed face to Alina, still standing in the priority section, her expression a careful mask of composure that didn't quite hide the hurt and anger beneath. "Everything all right here?" the man asked, glancing between them. "Fine," Frank said curtly. "Just a passenger refusing to follow instructions. Ma'am was just moving to the back, weren't you? The newcomer's eyebrows rose slightly as he took in the situation. The nearly empty bus, the priority seating, Alina's age. Something shifted in his expression. Actually, he said, reaching into his jacket pocket, I believe I'll need to see your operator ID, Frank. He withdrew a small leather wallet and flipped it open, revealing an identification card. Michael Reynolds, Central Metro Transit Authority Board of Directors. I'd like to understand exactly what's happening here. Frank's face drained of color so rapidly that for a moment, Alina was concerned he might faint. The bus remained at the stop, doors open, engine idling as three lives intersected in a moment that would alter each of their trajectories in ways none could yet imagine. Less than 30 minutes into her morning commute, Alina Jackson found herself at the center of a situation that would soon spiral beyond the confines of bus number 47, drawing in a web of characters whose lives were more intricately connected than any of them yet realized. And somewhere, in the complicated machinery of fate, karma was indeed preparing to strike, though its aim and timing would surprise them all. Michael Reynolds hadn't planned to take the bus that morning. As the newest member of the Transit Authority Board, his usual routine involved driving his Tesla to the downtown office where he oversaw legal operations for the city's transportation network. But when his car refused to start, leaving him with a choice between waiting for roadside assistance or catching the number 47 bus that conveniently stopped just 2 blocks from his Tudor-style home, he'd opted for the latter. Running late for an 8:30 meeting, he'd barely made it to the stop in time, never expecting that this mundane change in routine would thrust him into a situation that would test both his professional ethics and personal values. I asked for your operator ID, Michael repeated, his voice firm but measured. As an attorney who had worked his way up from a public defender's office to his current position, he had learned to project authority without aggression, a skill that served him well in the current tension-filled moment. Frank Mercer's hands trembled slightly as he unclipped the ID badge from his shirt pocket and handed it over. 23 years as a bus driver, and he'd never had a board member on his route, let alone one witnessing him in a direct confrontation with a passenger. Sir, I was just trying to manage the bus capacity. We have a church group getting on at Westfield, and I need to keep priority seating available for those who need it, Michael finished for him, glancing pointedly at Alina. Like this passenger, who would certainly qualify for priority seating based on our own published guidelines. He returned the ID badge to Frank, then turned to Alina. Ma'am, would you mind telling me what happened here? Alina, who had maintained her composed exterior despite the churning emotions beneath, gave a small nod. I boarded the bus as usual, and the driver instructed me to move to the back, despite these empty priority seats. When I questioned this, he threatened to call dispatch. Michael's expression remained neutral, though his eyes revealed a flicker of concern. I see, and has this happened before? Not with this driver, no, Alina replied carefully. She was aware of the other passengers watching, some pretending not to listen while others had abandoned all pretense, openly staring at the unfolding drama. Among those watching was Diane Chen, a 37-year-old high school history teacher who had been grading papers in the back corner of the bus. She had witnessed the entire exchange and was now recording discreetly with her phone, her teacher's instinct telling her that this was a moment that might need documentation. Diane had spent the previous evening preparing a lesson on civil rights history for her junior class, and the irony of witnessing what appeared to be a modern-day echo of Rosa Parks' experience was not lost on her. The young woman with blue hair, 22-year-old Zoe Miller, a barista and part-time art student, had also abandoned any pretense of disinterest. Born 2 generations removed from the civil rights era, she had learned about segregation through textbooks and documentary films. Seeing what looked like its ghost materialize on her morning commute left her stunned and uncertain how to respond. Well, this certainly warrants further discussion, Michael said, breaking the tense silence. He turned back to Frank. I think we should continue this conversation at the depot after your shift. For now, I suggest we get this bus moving again. Frank nodded stiffly, his earlier bluster deflated by the unexpected presence of authority. Yes, sir. Michael then addressed Alina. Ma'am, please take whatever seat you prefer. I apologize for any distress this situation has caused. Alina nodded her thanks and settled into one of the priority seats near the front, placing her bag on her lap. As she sat, she caught the eye of the elderly veteran across the aisle, who gave her a small nod of solidarity. His name was Robert Wilson, though Alina didn't know that yet. At 78, Robert had fought in Vietnam and returned to a country that often seemed to forget both his service and its own promises of equality. The exchange he had just witnessed stirred memories of his own battles against discrimination, both in the military and civilian life. As the bus finally pulled away from the stop, accelerating perhaps a bit too quickly, revealing Frank's lingering agitation, no one on board could have predicted how their lives would become entangled in the aftermath of this brief but significant confrontation. For while the initial drama appeared to have reached a temporary resolution, it had set in motion events that would expose long-buried secrets, challenge deeply held beliefs, and ultimately offer unexpected paths to redemption. Michael Reynolds took a seat 2 rows behind Alina, his mind already racing through the professional implications of what he'd witnessed. As head legal counsel for the Transit Authority, he would need to report this incident, potentially initiating disciplinary proceedings against Frank. But there was something else nagging at him, something beyond professional duty. The way Frank had specifically directed the older black woman to the back of the bus seemed too pointed, too evocative of historical wrongs, to be merely about managing passenger distribution. Unknown to Michael or anyone else on the bus, Frank Mercer's life was already unraveling before this incident. 3 months earlier, his wife of 30 years had left him, taking their savings and leaving him with mounting debts. 2 weeks ago, he'd received a diagnosis of early-stage prostate cancer. The medical leave paperwork sat unsigned in his locker at the depot, pride and financial necessity keeping him behind the wheel when he should have been focusing on treatment. None of this excused his behavior, but beneath his hostile exterior was a man drowning in personal crises. His lashing out at Alina, a misguided displacement of anger and fear that had found an unfortunately familiar target. As the bus continued its route, picking up and discharging passengers at its scheduled stops, the morning sunlight strengthened, filtering through the windows and casting long shadows down the center aisle. Alina stared out at the passing city landscape, her mind drifting between the present situation and memories of her past. Growing up in the shadow of Jim Crow, watching her parents fight for dignity, building her own life and career in a society that had changed significantly, yet retained troubling echoes of its biased foundations. At the Hamilton Street stop, a young man boarded who would add another layer to the unfolding story. Marcus Johnson, 29, was Frank Mercer's nephew, though he'd been estranged from his uncle for nearly 5 years. Tall and athletic, with close-cropped hair and intense dark eyes, Marcus worked as a paralegal at Reynolds and Associates, Michael Reynolds' law firm. He didn't immediately notice his boss sitting midway down the bus. His attention focused on the podcast playing through his earbuds as he made his way to an empty seat near the back. Diane Chen, still observing from her corner seat, noticed the newcomer and felt a jolt of recognition. Marcus had been a student in her history class 11 years earlier, one of her first students when she began teaching. She remembered him as bright and engaged, particularly in discussions about social justice. She watched as he settled into his seat, wondering if he too would become inadvertently drawn into the situation still simmering beneath the bus's superficially normal operation. As the bus approached the Westfield stop, tension returned to Frank's posture. This was where the church group he'd mentioned would be boarding, his justification for trying to move Alina to the back. As he pulled up to the curb, a cluster of elderly white men and women stood waiting, their Sunday best contrasting with the casual attire of other waiting passengers. The church group, 10 members of the First Presbyterian Senior Choir, filed onto the bus, led by Pastor Thomas Green, a soft-spoken man in his 70s with a gentle demeanor that belied a fierce commitment to community activism. Pastor Green had been instrumental in the church's transformation from a historically segregated congregation to one of the most diverse in the city, a journey not without resistance and conflict. As the choir members found seats throughout the bus, not just in the priority section, Pastor Green noticed Alina and smiled warmly. "Alina Jackson, what a wonderful surprise," he said, his voice carrying the cadence of a lifelong orator. "I've been meaning to call you about the health clinic the church is organizing next month, We could certainly use a retired nurse of your caliber." Eleanor's face brightened at the familiar voice. "Thomas, good to see you, and I'm not quite retired yet, still doing 3 shifts a week at Mercy General." Their easy familiarity drew curious glances from other passengers, including Frank, whose complexion had taken on an ashen quality. The church group he'd cited as justification for his actions clearly knew and respected the very woman he'd tried to banish to the back of the bus. In the middle of the bus, Michael Reynolds watched this interaction with interest, mentally adding another dimension to the incident he'd witnessed. Not only had Frank's actions been inappropriate and potentially discriminatory, but they seemed to have been based on false premises about the needs and relationships of his passengers. As the bus continued its journey through the city, the morning light strengthened, casting a golden glow over the diverse collection of humanity sharing this transitional space between their various destinations. None of them could have anticipated how their brief time together on bus number 47 would ripple outward, connecting their lives in unexpected ways and catalyzing changes that would ultimately transform not just their individual paths, but the community they collectively inhabited. This was no simple tale of immediate karmic retribution, but rather the beginning of a complex unraveling of hidden connections, unspoken biases, and opportunities for growth that would challenge each person touched by the morning's events. For karma, in its most profound sense, works not through quick strikes of poetic justice, but through the gradual revelation of truth and the opening of paths to redemption and understanding, even for those who might initially seem least deserving. Marcus Johnson removed one earbud as the commotion of the boarding church group interrupted his podcast. Glancing up, he froze in recognition. Not only was his estranged uncle driving the bus, but his boss, Michael Reynolds, was sitting halfway up the aisle. Before he could process this coincidence, he noticed something else. The evident tension in his uncle's posture, the unusual attentiveness of other passengers, and the subtle but unmistakable atmosphere of a situation recently diffused. He was about to replace his earbud when he caught sight of Eleanor Jackson greeting Pastor Green. Marcus had known Eleanor for most of his life. She had been his mother's closest friend, a surrogate aunt who had attended his graduation and helped him navigate college applications. The sight of her on his uncle's bus route added another layer of discomfort to his already complicated morning. Zoe Miller, the blue-haired art student, had been watching the unfolding scene with increasing interest. Born to privilege in the city's affluent North Side, she had spent the past 2 years at art school deliberately expanding her understanding of experiences unlike her own. As a visual arts major specializing in documentary photography, she recognized the rich human tableau before her, the intersecting lives momentarily united by public transit. Discreetly, she began sketching in the small notebook she always carried, capturing Frank's rigid posture, Eleanor's dignified profile, Michael's observant gaze. Near the front of the bus, Robert Wilson, the Vietnam veteran, had struck up a quiet conversation with one of the church choir members, Martha Gaines, a widow whose husband had served in the same war, though in a different division. Their shared memories created a small island of connection amid the larger currents of tension still flowing through the bus. "I haven't seen Bate at the VA meetings lately," Robert said, referring to Martha's daughter, who volunteered with veterans support groups. Martha's face clouded slightly. "She's been reassigned to the downtown office. Budget cuts, they said, but Bate thinks it's because she was pushing too hard for better mental health services." Robert nodded grimly, understanding all too well the bureaucratic barriers to proper care. His own struggles with PTSD had gone unaddressed for decades, improving only when Bate Gaines had helped connect him with a specialized program 3 years earlier. This conversation, though private, caught the attention of Diane Chen, the history teacher still observing from her corner seat. Her curriculum included a unit on the Vietnam War and its impact on American society. Hearing first-hand perspectives added depth to her understanding in a way textbooks never could. As the bus navigated through increasingly congested downtown streets, the temporary community within it continued to form these small bridges of connection, even as the earlier confrontation remained an unspoken presence in the shared space. Frank drove mechanically, his movements stiff, his eyes fixed straight ahead, avoiding the rearview mirror that would have shown him Michael Reynolds making notes on his phone, documenting the incident while it was still fresh. Eleanor's stop was approaching, Mercy General Hospital, where she had worked for over 3 decades. As she gathered her belongings and prepared to exit, Pastor Green touched her arm gently. "Eleanor, before you go, our choir is performing at the community center this Sunday. A benefit for the Youth Scholarship Program. We'd be honored if you'd attend." Eleanor smiled warmly. "I wouldn't miss it, Thomas. Will Jasmine be singing her solo?" "Would we dare present ourselves without our star soprano?" Thomas replied with a chuckle. 2 o'clock, and there's a reception afterward." Eleanor nodded and rose from her seat as the bus slowed for her stop. As she moved toward the exit, she passed by Frank, their eyes meeting briefly. In that moment, something complicated passed between them. Not forgiveness exactly, but a silent acknowledgement of the harm done and the long path toward any potential resolution. "Have a good day," Eleanor said simply, her dignity intact as she descended the steps to the sidewalk. Frank didn't respond, his gaze already shifting to the road ahead. But as the doors closed behind Eleanor, his shoulders slumped almost imperceptibly, as if some essential tension had departed with her. What no one on the bus knew, what Frank himself was only beginning to understand, was that his encounter with Eleanor had stirred something long buried in his consciousness. 37 years earlier, as a teenager in this same city, Frank had participated in a hate crime that had never been solved, never been connected to him. The victim had been a young black nurse walking home from the hospital late one night. Frank had been one of 5 white teenagers who had harassed her, damaged her car, and threatened worse before a passing police cruiser scattered them. The nurse's name had been Josephine Jackson, Eleanor's younger sister. Frank had spent nearly 4 decades burying this memory, rationalizing his participation, convincing himself it had been youthful mischief rather than the hate crime it clearly was. But the years of suppression had twisted something in him, corrupting his perspective in ways he only vaguely recognized. His reflexive demand that Eleanor move to the back of the bus had emerged from this corroded corner of his psyche, a manifestation of bias he would have denied possessing. As the bus continued its route without Eleanor, the dynamics shifted subtly. Michael Reynolds used the opportunity to move to a seat closer to the front, positioning himself where he could observe Frank more directly. The subtle power play was not lost on Marcus, who watched his boss with growing unease, wondering what had transpired before he boarded. At the next stop, Diane Chen gathered her graded papers and prepared to exit. Before leaving, she paused beside Zoe Miller, who was still sketching in her notebook. "That's really good," Diane said, nodding toward the drawing. A surprisingly detailed rendering of the bus interior with its various occupants. Zoe looked up, momentarily startled. "Thanks, it's just practice, really. I'm working on capturing candid human moments." "Well, you certainly picked an interesting one today," Diane replied, lowering her voice. "I recorded some of what happened earlier with the driver and the older woman. It didn't feel right, what he did." Zoe nodded, a spark of interest in her eyes. "I came in halfway through. What exactly happened?" Diane glanced toward the front of the bus, where Frank was staring straight ahead, oblivious to their conversation. "Let's just say it was a reminder that some historical attitudes haven't entirely disappeared. I'm Diane, by the way." "Zoe," they exchanged a quick handshake. "I'd actually love to hear more about what you saw. I'm working on a project about everyday interactions in public spaces." Diane hesitated only briefly before reaching into her bag and retrieving a business card. "I teach at Westridge High. Email me if you want to talk more about it." Zoe accepted the card just as the bus rolled to a stop. Diane disembarked with a final nod, leaving Zoe to ponder this unexpected connection, and the incident she had apparently missed that might provide perfect material for her documentary project. Near the back of the bus, Marcus Johnson was facing a dilemma. He had recognized the tension surrounding his uncle but wasn't sure if he should acknowledge his presence, or his relationship to the driver, to his boss. The estrangement between him and Frank had begun 5 years earlier, when Marcus had brought his then-boyfriend to a family gathering. Frank's reaction had been so hostile that Marcus had cut ties, maintaining contact only with his aunt until her departure 3 months ago. The irony that his uncle might now be in professional trouble for discriminatory behavior was not lost on Marcus. Part of him felt a vindictive satisfaction, yet another part, the part that remembered fishing trips and baseball games from his childhood, felt a complicated grief for the relationship that had soured so irreparably. As the bus approached the downtown district, more passengers prepared to disembark, including Michael Reynolds and Marcus. Their law firm was located in the glass-fronted Centennial Building, just 2 blocks from the Cathedral Street stop. Marcus decided to exit through the rear door, avoiding any awkward encounter with his uncle, but as he stood waiting for the bus to stop, Michael spotted him. "Marcus, I didn't realize you took this route," Michael said, genuine surprise in his voice. Marcus nodded, keeping his voice low. "Car trouble this morning, not my usual routine." Michael seemed about to say more when his attention was diverted by Frank, who had turned in his seat to stare at them with an expression of dawning recognition. The resemblance between Marcus and his uncle was subtle but unmistakable to anyone who knew to look for it. Something in the set of the jaw, the line of the brow. "You know each other?" Frank asked, his voice carrying a note of disbelief. The bus had stopped now, doors opening to release the downtown-bound passengers. Marcus felt trapped in a moment of excruciating awkwardness, caught between his estranged uncle and his employer, who was apparently already involved in some sort of situation with Frank. "Mr. Reynolds is my boss," Marcus said stiffly, avoiding direct eye contact with Frank. "I'm a paralegal at his firm." Frank's face registered shock, then something harder to define, a mixture of bitterness and resigned amusement. "Well, isn't that something? Small world getting smaller by the minute." Michael glanced between them, clearly sensing the undercurrent of tension. "You two know each other." Before Marcus could decide how to respond, Frank answered, his voice flat. "He's my sister's kid, though he hasn't had much use for family these past few years." The pointed barb landed as intended, sending a flush of anger up Marcus's neck. Rather than engage, he turned toward the exit. "We should go, Mr. Reynolds. We have that 9 o'clock deposition prep." Michael nodded, though his expression suggested he would have questions later. As they stepped off the bus, Frank called after them. "Hey, Mr. Board of Directors," he said, an edge to his voice. "When you write up your report about me, make sure you include that my own flesh and blood was there to witness my downfall. Makes for a neater story, doesn't it?" The doors closed before either Marcus or Michael could respond, the bus pulling away into the flow of traffic, leaving them standing on the sidewalk in uncomfortable silence. "I take it there's some history there," Michael said finally, understating the obvious. Marcus sighed, suddenly exhausted though the workday had barely begun. "My uncle and I haven't spoken in years. It's complicated." Michael nodded thoughtfully. "Well, it just got more complicated, I'm afraid. There was an incident on the bus before you boarded. Your uncle directed an elderly black woman to move to the back of the bus, despite plenty of available priority seating up front. When she questioned him, he became confrontational." Marcus closed his eyes briefly, a mixture of embarrassment and resignation washing over him. "That sounds like Frank," he said quietly. "Was the woman's name Alina by any chance? Alina Jackson?" Michael's eyebrows rose in surprise. "Yes, actually, you know her." "She's a family friend, or was before," Marcus trailed off, then shook his head. "This is surreal." As they began walking toward their office building, Michael's expression grew more serious. "As a board member, I can't ignore what I witnessed. There will need to be an investigation." Marcus nodded, understanding the professional obligation, even as he grappled with the personal implications. "I understand, and I should probably recuse myself from any involvement given the relationship." "Agreed," Michael said, then added more gently. "Though if you wanted to reach out to Ms. Jackson, personally rather than professionally, that might be appropriate." She seemed quite shaken by the experience. Marcus was silent for a moment, considering. Alina had been present at many pivotal moments in his life: his high school graduation, his college acceptance, the funeral of his grandfather. She had also been noticeably absent these past 5 years, another casualty of the rift Frank had created. Perhaps this strange collision of worlds offered an opportunity to rebuild at least one bridge that his uncle's bigotry had burned. "I'll think about it," he said finally, as they reached the revolving doors of the Centennial Building. Neither man noticed Zoe Miller following at a discreet distance, her notebook open, capturing the tail end of their sidewalk conversation in quick, economical sketches. adding another thread to the tapestry of interconnected lives that had begun to weave together on bus number 47. Back on the bus, Frank Mercer drove with mechanical precision, his thoughts far from the road before him. The morning's events had shaken loose memories and emotions he'd long suppressed, creating fissures in the carefully constructed identity he'd built for himself. The unexpected appearance of his estranged nephew, alongside the transit board member who had witnessed his confrontation with Alina Jackson, felt like more than coincidence. It felt like the universe conspiring against him, creating a perfect storm of accountability he had evaded for decades. As he navigated the familiar route, his mind kept returning to that night 37 years ago, to Josephine Jackson walking to her car after a late hospital shift, to the jeers and threats he and his friends had hurled at her, to the sickening crunch of a baseball bat against her windshield. He remembered her face, frightened but defiant, and how her expression had reminded him even then of his own mother's when she faced his father's drunken rages. That flash of recognition had been enough for him to pull back, to urge his friends to leave when the police car appeared in the distance, but not enough for him to intervene, to stop what had already been done, or to come forward afterward. The irony that Alina Jackson, Josephine's sister, had been on his bus route for years without him making the connection was a cruel twist. Had he known, would he have treated her differently? The question probed at a tender spot in his conscience that he quickly armored over with self-justification. People changed. He wasn't that angry teenager anymore. He hadn't known who she was. Yet he had still told her to move to the back of the bus. The realization landed with uncomfortable weight. Whatever narrative he had constructed about his own growth and decency crumbled beneath the stark evidence of his actions that morning. And now, with Michael Reynolds, a transit board member and apparently his nephew's boss, as a witness, there would be consequences beyond the internal discomfort of self-recognition. At the next stop, Pastor Thomas Green and several of his choir members disembarked, but not before the pastor paused beside Frank's seat. "God gives us all opportunities for growth and redemption," he said quietly, his kind eyes meeting Frank's guarded gaze. "Sometimes they come in unexpected ways." Before Frank could respond, the pastor had moved on, leaving him to wonder if the comment had been coincidental spiritual wisdom or a more pointed observation about the morning's events. Either way, it lingered with him as he closed the doors and pulled back into traffic. The bus was emptier now, the rush hour crowds thinning as the morning progressed. Among the remaining passengers was Robert Wilson, the Vietnam veteran, who had been observing the various interactions with the quiet attentiveness of someone accustomed to reading human dynamics for potential threats, a habit formed in war and never fully abandoned in peace. Robert had witnessed Alina's dignity in the face of Frank's hostility, the transit board member's intervention, Marcus's discomfort upon recognizing his uncle, and the subtle ways the other passengers had responded throughout. What interested him most, however, was the change in Frank's demeanor after Alina had departed, the slight deflation, the creeping shadow of what might have been regret. As Robert's stop approached, he gathered his cane and the small bag containing his VA prescription refills. Making his way to the front, he paused beside Frank's seat. "You know," Robert said, his voice carrying the gravel of age and years of cigarettes before he'd quit, "I fought alongside black men in Vietnam. When we were in the jungle, nobody gave a damn about skin color. Too busy trying to stay alive. Funny how people forget that lesson back in the world." Frank's hands tightened on the steering wheel. "I don't need a lecture from you, old man." Robert shrugged, unperturbed by the hostility. "Not offering one, just an observation. My stop's coming up." As the bus slowed, Robert added, "That woman you tried to send to the back, she volunteers at the VA hospital 3 times a month, sits with dying vets who have no family, holds their hands so they don't cross over alone." He tapped his cane lightly on the floor for emphasis. "Worth thinking about." The bus stopped, and Robert descended carefully, nodding a brief thanks as Frank grudgingly offered an arm for stability. Left alone with this latest piece of information about Alina Jackson, Frank felt the protective shell around his conscience crack a little further. The remainder of his morning route passed without incident, but Frank's mind was caught in a spiral of memory and rationalization, punctuated by moments of uncomfortable clarity. By the time he reached the depot for his midday break, he had convinced himself that the situation had been blown out of proportion, that Michael Reynolds would likely forget about it, and that the whole matter would dissipate with time. This fragile self-deception was shattered the moment he entered the driver's break room. Conversation died as he crossed the threshold, a dozen pairs of eyes turning to regard him with expressions ranging from curiosity to outright disapproval. "What?" Frank demanded, immediately defensive. His longtime colleague, Hector Ramirez, shook his head slowly. "Man, what were you thinking, telling a black grandmother to move to the back of the bus in 2023? Frank's stomach dropped. "How did you?" "It's all over the group chat," said Shauna Williams, one of the few black drivers at the depot. She held up her phone, displaying a text thread with dozens of messages. "Someone posted a video." "Video?" Frank repeated, his voice hollow. Shauna nodded grimly. "History teacher on your route recorded the whole thing. She sent it to her department head, who sent it to his wife, who works in HR here. Now everyone's seen it." Frank sank into the nearest chair, the full implications beginning to dawn on him. Not only had a transit board member witnessed his behavior, but there was video evidence already circulating through the company. The careful compartmentalization of his life, the separation between his actions and their consequences, was collapsing around him. "Look," he began, a defensive edge to his voice. "It wasn't about race. We had a church group getting on and I needed the priority seating clear. That's all." The silence that greeted this explanation was damning in its skepticism. "The church group that ended up sitting all over the bus?" Hector asked pointedly. "The one whose pastor seemed to know the woman you tried to send to the back, that church group." Frank had no response. The carefully constructed narrative he'd created to justify his actions couldn't withstand the scrutiny of those who knew the practical realities of their shared profession. Before the conversation could continue, the break room door opened again, and Supervisor Gloria Martinez entered, her expression grave. "Frank," she said, her tone professionally neutral despite the tension evident in her posture, "I need to see you in my office, now." As Frank followed her out, the weight of the morning's events pressed down on him with crushing force. Whatever happened next, disciplinary action, suspension, possibly even termination, would be the direct consequence of choices he had made, both that morning and in the decades of unexamined bias that had preceded it. For the first time, there would be no evading accountability, no comfortable distance between his actions and their impact. Karma, it seemed, had indeed caught up with Frank Mercer. But its form was not the swift, satisfying strike of poetic justice that observers might have wished for. Instead, it arrived as the slow, inexorable revelation of truth, about himself, about the connections between past and present, and about the ripple effects of bias that extended far beyond a single confrontation on a city bus. And even now, as Frank braced himself for professional consequences, he could not have anticipated how the events set in motion that morning would continue to unfold, drawing in others whose lives intersected with his in ways yet to be revealed, creating opportunities for deeper reckonings, and perhaps, eventually, the possibility of genuine redemption. Meanwhile, across town at Mercy General Hospital, Eleanor Jackson was immersed in her nursing duties, her professional composure masking the emotional residue of the morning's confrontation. As she checked vital signs on her third patient of the day, an elderly man recovering from hip replacement surgery, her mind kept returning to the bus driver's face, to the hardness in his eyes when he'd told her to move to the back, and to the fleeting shadow of something else, recognition. Regret that had passed across his features as she departed. It wasn't the first time Eleanor had faced discrimination, nor would it likely be the last. At 63, she had developed strategies for processing such encounters without allowing them to consume her energy or diminish her spirit. Still, there was something about this particular incident that nagged at her, something beyond the obvious echo of historical segregation practices. Something in the bus driver's face had seemed almost personal, as if his animosity toward her stemmed from more than general prejudice. "Nurse Jackson," the patient's voice drew her back to the present moment. "You seemed far away just then." Eleanor smiled apologetically. "Just thinking about the day ahead, Mr. Garcia. Your blood pressure is looking much better this morning. How's your pain level?" As she continued her rounds, Alina maintained her professional focus, but part of her mind remained engaged with the puzzle of Frank Mercer and their uncomfortable encounter. The intervention of the transit board member had been unexpected but welcome, a reminder that sometimes witnesses would step forward rather than look away. Yet she couldn't help wondering what would have happened had Michael Reynolds not been present. How many similar incidents occurred daily without such intervention? Their impact felt only by those directly harmed. During her lunch break, Alina's phone chimed with a text message from an unfamiliar number. "Ms. Jackson, this is Marcus Johnson. We haven't spoken in several years, but I was on the bus this morning and learned about what happened with my Uncle Frank. I'd like to talk if you're willing. I'm deeply sorry for his behavior." The message left Alina momentarily stunned. She hadn't recognized Marcus on the bus. The last time she'd seen him had been at his college graduation, before the family rift that had separated him from his uncle. The knowledge that he had witnessed her humiliation added another layer of complexity to the already tangled situation. After a moment's reflection, she typed a response. "Hello, Marcus. It's good to hear from you after so long. I'm working until 6 p.m. today, but would be happy to talk afterward. The hospital cafeteria is quiet in the evening." His reply came quickly. "I'll be there at 6:30, thank you." Alina set her phone aside, feeling the morning's events taking on new dimensions. What had seemed like an isolated incident, uncomfortable but ultimately manageable, was expanding into something larger, a nexus of connections and history that extended beyond that single moment on the bus. Across town in the sleek conference room of Reynolds and Associates, Marcus Johnson was finding it increasingly difficult to focus on the deposition preparation meeting. The unexpected convergence of his professional and personal lives had left him off balance, and the impending meeting with Alina added another layer of complexity to an already challenging day. Michael Reynolds noticed his distraction. As the meeting concluded and the other paralegals filed out with their assignments, he gestured for Marcus to remain behind. "You've been elsewhere all morning," Michael observed, not unkindly. "Understandable given the circumstances." Marcus nodded, grateful for his boss's perception. "I've arranged to meet with Alina Jackson this evening. She was important to me growing up, a family friend until my uncle's attitudes created a rift." Michael leaned back in his chair, studying the younger man thoughtfully. "This situation with your uncle, it's become more complicated than I initially realized. The Transit Authority has received multiple reports about this morning's incident, including video footage from another passenger. There will be a disciplinary hearing next week." Marcus winced. Despite his estrangement from Frank, the public nature of his uncle's disgrace brought complicated emotions to the surface. "Will you be involved in that process?" "As the witnessing board member, yes, though I'll recuse myself from final decisions given our connection through you." Michael paused, weighing his next words carefully. "There's something else you should know. The incident with Ms. Jackson isn't isolated. We've received previous complaints about your uncle, nothing as blatant, but a pattern of differential treatment toward minority passengers. This may have been building for some time." The revelation shouldn't have surprised Marcus, given what he knew of his uncle's attitudes, yet hearing it confirmed sent a wave of shame through him. Shame by association, even though he had severed ties with Frank years ago. "I appreciate your transparency," Marcus said finally. "And for what it's worth, I'm sorry that my family connection has created this awkward situation." Michael shook his head. "You're not responsible for your uncle's actions, Marcus, but I am curious, and this is a personal question, not a professional one, about what happened between you two. You mentioned a rift." If anyone else had asked, Marcus might have deflected. But Michael Reynolds had earned his respect over 3 years of employment, demonstrating consistently fair leadership and genuine concern for his staff's well-being. Moreover, given Michael's involvement in the transit situation, there was practical value in providing context. "5 years ago, I brought my then-boyfriend to a family gathering," Marcus explained, his voice steady despite the lingering hurt behind the words. "Frank's reaction was extreme. He said some things I couldn't forgive, and I've had no contact with him since. My aunt tried to maintain a relationship with me, but she left him 3 months ago. I heard through my mother that he's been struggling, financially, health-wise, but honestly, I haven't had much sympathy to spare." Michael nodded, absorbing this information with a thoughtful expression. That adds another dimension to consider, not as an excuse for his behavior, certainly, but as context for understanding the whole person. What Marcus didn't say, what he wasn't entirely ready to articulate even to himself, was that his uncle's obvious bias toward Alina had forced him to confront uncomfortable questions about family loyalty, accountability, and the limits of compassion. Was he obligated to help Frank face the consequences of his actions? Did their blood relationship create responsibilities that transcended the hurt of rejection? Or was his first obligation to Alina, who had shown him nothing but kindness throughout his life? These questions would find no easy resolution in the corporate surroundings of the law firm. They would need to be addressed later, in his conversation with Alina and in the quiet reckonings of his own conscience. As the workday continued, the ripples from the morning's confrontation spread further through the lives of those who had witnessed it. Diane Chen, the history teacher who had recorded the incident, faced her own dilemma as her video began circulating beyond her intended recipients. She had shared it initially with her department head as documentation of a concerning incident. She hadn't anticipated that it would be forwarded to Transit Authority HR, then to the broader employee network. Now, as she stood before her junior history class, discussing the Montgomery bus boycott and Rosa Parks' act of resistance, she felt an uncanny connection between historical events and the morning's echo of them. The temptation to share the video with her students as a contemporary example was strong, yet professional ethics gave her pause. The bus driver, problematic as his behavior had been, deserved due process rather than trial by social media. Ms. Chen, a student's raised hand interrupted her thoughts. You said segregation on buses was outlawed, but does that stuff still happen today? The question created a perfect opening, yet Diane hesitated, conscious of the complexity underlying what seemed like a straightforward moral situation. Formal segregation is illegal, she said carefully, but bias can still manifest in ways that echo historical patterns. Just this morning I witnessed. She paused, reconsidering. Actually, rather than telling you about a specific incident, let's discuss how we might respond if we observed discrimination in a public setting. What responsibilities do bystanders have? What risks might they face in speaking up? What approaches might be most effective in addressing bias while preserving everyone's dignity? The discussion that followed was one of the most engaged of the semester, with students wrestling with questions of moral responsibility, effective allyship, and the balance between justice and compassion. What none of them knew was that their teacher was simultaneously working through these same questions regarding the video she had recorded and the now viral incident she had witnessed. By late afternoon, news of the confrontation on bus number 47 had reached Pastor Thomas Green, who was troubled not only by the event itself, but by his congregation's peripheral involvement. Frank Mercer's justification for moving Alina, making space for the church group, had implicated them, however unwittingly, in an act of discrimination. The irony was painful, given the church's deliberate work toward racial reconciliation over the past decade. After prayer and reflection, Pastor Green made two decisions. First, he would reach out to Alina personally, beyond the casual invitation he had extended on the bus, to ensure she knew the church stood with her. Second, he would contact the Transit Authority to clarify that his group had never requested special accommodation, particularly not at the expense of other passengers. As he picked up the phone to make these calls, Pastor Green was guided by a principle he often shared with his congregation. That true reconciliation required not just apology but concrete action to address harm and prevent its recurrence. The morning's incident, unfortunate as it was, offered an opportunity to demonstrate this principle in practice. By early evening, as the city's rhythm shifted from workday to leisure hours, the various individuals connected by the morning's events were preparing for encounters that would further intertwine their stories. Alina finishing her shift at the hospital, Marcus anxiously making his way to meet her, Frank facing disciplinary procedures at the depot, Michael documenting his observations for the transit board, Diane wrestling with the ethical implications of her recording, Zoe incorporating the day's observations into her documentary project, Robert sharing the experience with fellow veterans at his weekly support group, and Pastor Green mobilizing his congregation's response. None of them yet fully understood how deeply their lives were already connected, or how the confrontation on the bus had simply made visible threads of relationship and responsibility that had existed long before. But as evening fell over the city, these connections were about to become clearer, offering challenges and opportunities that would test each person's capacity for growth, forgiveness, and change. As the hospital cafeteria clock approached 6:30, Alina Jackson sat at a corner table, a cup of herbal tea warming her hands. The day's nursing duties had provided a welcome distraction from thoughts of the morning's confrontation, but now, waiting for Marcus, she found herself mentally replaying the interaction with Frank Mercer. There had been something naggingly familiar about him, though she couldn't place where she might have encountered him before today. "Hello, Ms. Jackson." Alina looked up to see Marcus Johnson standing beside her table, more formally dressed than she remembered him, the boy she had known now fully a man. Yet his eyes still held the same thoughtful intensity that had marked him as a child. "Marcus," she said warmly, gesturing to the chair across from her. "It's been too long, and please, it's still Alina to you." He smiled tentatively as he sat, clearly nervous. "Thank you for agreeing to meet. I wanted to apologize for my uncle's behavior this morning. It was inexcusable." Alina studied him for a moment before responding. "You don't owe me an apology for someone else's actions, Marcus, especially someone you've been estranged from for years." Marcus looked surprised. "You knew about that?" "Your mother and I still talk," Alina explained. "She told me about what happened at the family gathering. I was proud of you for standing your ground, though sorry for the pain it caused." The simple validation in her words eased some of the tension Marcus had been carrying. "Still, finding myself on that bus this morning, witnessing how he treated you, it brought back a lot of complicated feelings. Guilt by association, I suppose." Alina reached across the table to briefly touch his hand. "We don't choose our family, Marcus. We only choose how we respond to them." She paused, then added, "Though I have to admit, there was something about your uncle that seemed familiar to me beyond just this morning. I feel like I've encountered him before, but I can't place where or when." Marcus hesitated, uncertainty written across his features. "I've been wondering about that too. The way he singled you out seemed specific, almost personal." "That's exactly it," Alina agreed, her brow furrowing in thought. "It wasn't just general rudeness or even typical racial bias. It felt targeted somehow." Before Marcus could respond, his phone chimed with a text message. Glancing at it, his expression shifted to one of alarm. "I'm sorry," he said, looking back at Alina. "It's from my mother. My Uncle Frank has been suspended pending investigation, and apparently he's not taking it well. She's worried about his state of mind." Alina nodded, understanding. "Do you need to go?" Marcus seemed torn, loyalty to family warring with his desire to make amends to Alina. "I should check on the situation, but I don't want to cut our conversation short. Could we perhaps continue it another time?" "Of course," Alina assured him. "Family matters take priority, even complicated ones." She paused, then added with gentle emphasis, "Marcus, whatever happens with the Transit Authority investigation, I hope you know that I don't hold any ill will toward you. What your uncle did was wrong, but accountability doesn't have to mean destruction. Sometimes it can be the beginning of something better." Her words carried a wisdom born of years, navigating the complex intersections of justice and compassion. Marcus felt their weight as he stood to leave, sensing that Alina was offering something more profound than mere absolution for his vicarious guilt. "I'll call you tomorrow," he promised. "And thank you, not just for meeting me today, but for everything. For being a constant presence when I was growing up, for showing me what integrity looks like." As Marcus departed, Alina remained at the table, sipping her cooling tea thoughtfully. The encounter had stirred memories of Marcus as a child. Bright, sensitive, always asking the difficult questions that adults often avoided. She had sensed early on that he might be gay, long before he came out to his family, and had tried in small ways to let him know he was accepted and valued exactly as he was. When Frank's rejection had caused the family rift, she had felt a deep sadness for the pain inflicted in the name of misguided moral certainty. And now, years later, their paths had crossed again through another act of prejudice, a strange symmetry that suggested the unfinished business of the past persisting into the present. Eleanor's thoughts were interrupted by the arrival of another unexpected visitor, Pastor Thomas Green, still in his clerical collar from an evening counseling session at the church. "Eleanor," he said, his gentle voice carrying genuine concern, "may I join you for a moment?" She nodded, gesturing to the chair Marcus had vacated. "Thomas, twice in one day, to what do I owe the pleasure?" The pastor settled his lanky frame into the chair, his expression serious. "I've heard more about what happened on the bus this morning, about how the driver used our church group as an excuse to try to make you move to the back. I wanted you to know that we had no part in that, made no such request, and I'm deeply sorry that our presence was used in that way." Eleanor's expression softened. "I never thought for a moment that you or your congregation had anything to do with it, Thomas. You've always shown me nothing but respect and kindness." "Nevertheless," Pastor Green continued, "it troubles me greatly. Our church has worked so hard to move beyond its segregated past to become a true community of welcome. To be invoked, even unknowingly, in an act of discrimination feels like a betrayal of everything we stand for." His distress was evident, and Eleanor found herself in the unexpected position of offering comfort. "What matters is how we respond when these things happen, Thomas. Your church has been a leader in reconciliation work in this city. One bus driver's actions doesn't change that." The pastor nodded slowly. "I've contacted the transit authority to make that clear, but I've also been thinking about how we might use this as a teaching moment for our congregation, with your permission, of course. Not to sensationalize what happened, but to remind people that these issues aren't just historical. They're present and ongoing." Eleanor considered this thoughtfully. "I'd be open to that, depending on the approach. Not as a victim to be pitied, but perhaps as part of a broader conversation about how we create genuine community across differences." Podcast host Reggie Miller slipped into this corner booth of the coffee shop. A brief, "If you're watching now, it would be incredibly helpful if you could subscribe and leave a comment letting me know where you're tuning in from," dropping effortlessly from his lips. The words he spoke during every recording session becoming second nature after years of building his platform. His latest interview subject had canceled last minute, and he found himself with an unexpected hour of free time before his next appointment. As he sipped his coffee, his attention was drawn to a conversation at a nearby table. An elderly black woman and a white pastor engaged in what appeared to be an earnest discussion. There was something familiar about the woman, though Reggie couldn't immediately place where he might have seen her before. It wasn't until he overheard a fragment of their conversation, "What happened on the bus this morning?" that recognition dawned. He had watched a video earlier that day, shared by a colleague in media, showing a confrontation between a bus driver and an older black passenger. The footage had been circulating in journalist circles, part of an ongoing conversation about documenting everyday discrimination versus respecting privacy. Reggie hesitated, his journalist's instinct to approach and inquire warring with respect for what was clearly a private conversation. Before he could decide, his phone buzzed with a text from his producer. "Have you seen the bus video that's going viral? We should cover this on Friday's podcast. Human interest angle with social justice implications." The synchronicity was striking. Reggie typed a quick reply. "Looking into it, might have a lead. We'll call you in an hour." Across town, in a small apartment cluttered with art supplies and photography equipment, Zoe Miller was editing the sketches she had made on the bus that morning. Her documentary project on intersections, exploring how strangers' lives momentarily connect in public spaces, had taken an unexpected turn with the confrontation she had partially witnessed. The quick studies she had captured, the rigid posture of the bus driver, the dignified profile of the older woman, the attentive gaze of the man in the suit, told only part of a story whose full dimensions were still unfolding. Her phone chimed with an email notification from Diane Chen, the history teacher who had given her a business card. "Hi Zoe, I wanted to follow up on our brief conversation this morning. The video I recorded has been shared more widely than I intended and is creating some complicated ethical questions for me. I'd be interested in your perspective as a documentary artist. Are these moments of public conflict appropriate material for documentation and sharing? Where do we draw the line between exposing injustice and respecting privacy? If you'd like to discuss this further, perhaps we could meet." The email crystallized questions Zoe had been wrestling with herself. Her art had always focused on finding beauty and meaning in ordinary moments, not on capturing conflict or controversy. Yet this morning's events had revealed dimensions of human interaction, both troubling and inspiring, that felt important to witness and record. In the small veterans center across from the VA hospital, Robert Wilson was sharing his experience on the bus with his weekly support group. The other veterans, men and women whose service spanned from Vietnam to Afghanistan, listened with varying expressions of recognition and concern. "Reminded me of basic training in '67, Robert concluded. "Integrated on paper, segregated in reality. Some things change slower than others." Bate Gaines, the group facilitator and daughter of Martha from the church choir, nodded thoughtfully. "What strikes me about your story, Robert, is how many different reactions there were on that bus. The driver's bias, yes, but also the board member stepping in, the pastor recognizing the woman, you speaking up. A whole spectrum of human response in one small space." "Makes you think about ripple effects," added James Howard, a Desert Storm veteran. "One person's actions affecting everyone around them for better or worse, like in combat, one decision changing the course for the whole unit." Bate considered this thoughtfully. "That's a powerful metaphor, and it makes me wonder about the ripples from this incident, how it might be affecting each person involved, changing their course in ways they couldn't anticipate." None of them could know just how prescient this observation would prove to be. As the connections between the various witnesses and participants in the morning's confrontation continued to multiply and deepen, creating a web of relationship and consequence that would ultimately transform not just individual lives, but aspects of the community itself. In a sparse apartment across town, Frank Mercer sat alone at his kitchen table, a half-empty bottle of whiskey before him. His suspension notice lay beside it, the official language outlining the terms of his administrative leave pending investigation into alleged discriminatory conduct toward a passenger. The rapid unraveling of his life, his wife's departure, his cancer diagnosis, and now this professional disgrace, left him feeling unmoored, adrift in a current of circumstances he could no longer control. The anger that had sustained him for so long was giving way to something more complicated, a mixture of self-pity, fear, and the first uncomfortable stirrings of genuine remorse. His phone rang, the screen displaying Marcus Sell, his nephew's name appearing for the first time in 5 years. Frank stared at it, momentarily paralyzed by surprise before finally answering on the 4th ring. "Yeah," his voice came out rougher than intended, the whiskey and emotion creating a gravelly edge. "Uncle Frank," Marcus sounded uncertain, as if he half expected to be hung up on. "Mom's worried about you, asked me to check in." Frank laughed, a harsh sound without humor. "Of course she is. Always cleaning up my messes, isn't she? Even uses her gay son to do it, knowing I can't afford to alienate what family I've got left." There was a pause, then Marcus replied with careful restraint, "I can call back when you're sober." "No, wait," Frank said quickly, fear of isolation temporarily overriding his pride. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean." He trailed off, unaccustomed to apology. "It's fine," Marcus said, though his tone suggested otherwise. "Are you okay? Mom said you've been suspended." Frank stared at the official letter. Pending investigation, video evidence, board member witness, the whole 9 yards. He took another swallow of whiskey. "Your boss saw the whole thing. Bet that was uncomfortable for you." "Why did you do it, Uncle Frank?" Marcus asked, the directness of the question catching Frank off guard. "Why tell that woman to move to the back? There were plenty of empty seats up front." The question hung in the air between them, deceptively simple yet loaded with implications that extended far beyond the specific incident. In that moment, Frank could have retreated behind defensive anger or dismissive rationalization. Instead, something in his nephew's tone, the genuine desire to understand rather than simply condemn, breached a wall he had maintained for decades. "I don't know," he admitted, the words unfamiliar in his mouth. "It just came out like a reflex I didn't know I had." He paused, then added more quietly, "But that's not entirely true. I recognized her, Marcus, not consciously at first, but something in me knew who she was." "What do you mean?" Marcus asked, confusion evident in his voice. "You knew Alina Jackson before today." Frank closed his eyes, the weight of long-buried memory pressing down on him. Not her sister, Josephine. It was a long time ago, back when I was 17. Me and some friends, we did something I've been trying to forget ever since. As Frank began to unburden himself of the decades-old secret, the harassment of Josephine Jackson, the vandalism of her car, the threats that had awakened in him his first real understanding of the ugliness he was capable of, he couldn't have known that his confession to Marcus would become the first thread in a complex tapestry of revelation and reconciliation that would ultimately involve everyone touched by that morning's confrontation on bus number 47. For karma, in its most profound manifestation, works not through simple retribution, but through the intricate unfolding of truth, exposing the connections between past and present, between action and consequence, between harm and healing. And sometimes, its most powerful expression comes not in the moment of strike, but in the gradual illumination that follows, revealing paths to redemption that had previously seemed impossible. The following morning dawned with a clarity that belied the emotional turbulence of the previous day. Eleanor Jackson, preparing for another shift at Mercy General, found herself unusually preoccupied with thoughts of Frank Mercer. After her conversation with Marcus, she had spent a restless night piecing together fragments of memory, trying to place where she might have encountered the bus driver before yesterday. It wasn't until she was pouring her morning coffee that a connection suddenly crystallized. Frank Mercer. The name had seemed vaguely familiar when she'd first heard it, but she hadn't been able to place it. Now, with a jolt of recognition, she remembered where she had seen it before, on a list of witnesses in the police report filed after the attack on her sister Josephine 37 years earlier. The vandalism of Josephine's car had never been officially solved, the perpetrators never identified beyond teenage males, presumed white. Frank Mercer had been questioned as someone who lived in the area and might have seen something, but he had claimed to have no knowledge of the incident. Eleanor, who had accompanied her shaken sister to the police station, recalled seeing the witness list, including Frank's name and statement. The coincidence seemed too specific to ignore. Could it be mere chance that the same Frank Mercer who had been peripherally connected to that long-ago incident was now the bus driver who had tried to force her to the back of the bus? Or was there a more direct link? Had Frank been more than just a witness? The questions multiplied as Eleanor made her way to the hospital, her nurse's mind methodically sorting through possibilities and implications. By the time she reached Mercy General, she had decided to look into the connection further, perhaps by requesting a copy of the old police report. Not out of a desire for vengeance, but from a need to understand, to make sense of the strange collision of past and present that had occurred on bus number 47. Across town, Marcus Johnson was grappling with the aftermath of his conversation with his uncle. Frank's confession, that he had recognized Eleanor as the sister of a woman he and his friends had harassed decades earlier, had left Marcus stunned and conflicted. On one hand, the admission revealed depths of bias and wrongdoing beyond what he had attributed to his uncle. On the other, Frank's willingness to acknowledge his past actions suggested a capacity for honesty that Marcus hadn't expected. As he prepared for work, Marcus debated whether to share this information with Michael Reynolds. His boss's involvement with the Transit Authority investigation created a professional obligation, yet the confession had come during a personal, family conversation. The boundaries between his professional and personal responsibilities had never felt more blurred. His decision was complicated by another factor, his growing concern about his uncle's mental state. Frank's combination of alcohol, depression, and recent cancer diagnosis created a volatile situation. Adding public exposure of a decades-old hate crime could push him toward truly destructive choices. Yet concealing this information felt like a betrayal of Eleanor, whose dignity and right to truth weighed equally in Marcus's conscience. In the end, he decided on a middle path. He would speak with Eleanor first, sharing what he had learned from Frank and asking her preference about how to proceed. Whatever course of action followed would be guided by her wishes, respecting her agency in a situation where it had been repeatedly compromised, first by Frank's original harassment of her sister, then by his discriminatory behavior on the bus. Meanwhile, at Westridge High School, Diane Chen was facing her own ethical dilemma as she arrived to find her principal waiting in her classroom, expression grave. "Morning, Diane," he said, gesturing toward her desk chair as he leaned against a student desk. We need to talk about a video that's circulating, one you apparently recorded on your bus yesterday. Diane set down her bag, her stomach tightening. I shared that video with Jason in history just to document what I'd witnessed. I didn't realize it would spread beyond the department. Principal Harkins nodded, his expression neutral. Jason's wife works in transit HR. She shared it with her department as evidence in what could be a discrimination case. From there, well, you know how these things go. It's on 3 different social media platforms now with tens of thousands of views. Oh no, Diane said quietly, the implications sinking in. I never intended for it to become public like that. I understand, Harkins assured her. And to be clear, you're not in any trouble. There's no expectation of privacy on public transportation, and you were documenting something concerning. But the bus drivers' union has reached out about possible invasion of privacy, and the Transit Authority's legal department wants to interview you about what you witnessed. I wanted to give you a heads up before they contact you directly. As Principal Harkins outlined the potential legal and professional implications, Diane found herself thinking about the history lessons she taught, about documentation of injustice, about bearing witness, about the complex ethics of exposing wrongdoing. She had always presented these as relatively straightforward moral imperatives. Now, faced with the real-world consequences of her own documentation, the complexities were far more apparent. Across the city, in the offices of Reynolds and Associates, Michael Reynolds was meeting with the Transit Authority's General Counsel, Barbara Winters. As both a board member and a witness to the incident on bus number 47, Michael occupied a unique position in the unfolding investigation. The video complicates things, Barbara was saying, referencing the now viral footage shot by Diane Chen. It substantiates your account of the incident, but it also creates public relations concerns. We're already getting media inquiries. Michael nodded thoughtfully. From a legal standpoint, the evidence is pretty clear. Frank Mercer directed a black passenger to move to the back of the bus despite available priority seating. When challenged, he became confrontational. The pattern of previous complaints suggests this wasn't an isolated incident. Agreed, Barbara said. The disciplinary case is straightforward. What's more complex is how we address this publicly. There's historical weight to this particular form of discrimination that makes it especially charged. As they discussed various approaches, Michael's phone buzzed with a text from Marcus. Need to speak with you privately about the bus incident. New information that may be relevant to the investigation. Can we meet after work? The cryptic message added yet another layer to the already complicated situation. What new information could Marcus have, and how might it impact the Transit Authority's approach? By midday, the ripples from the incident on bus number 47 had reached even further, touching lives seemingly distant from the original confrontation. Zoe Miller, the art student who had sketched the scene, received a call from her advisor at the School of Visual Arts. Zoe, I just saw a video from a bus incident yesterday. It looks very similar to some of the sketches you showed me for your Intersections project. Were you there when this happened? I came in partway through, Zoe explained. I didn't see the initial confrontation, but I observed the aftermath and made some sketches. This is potentially significant documentary material, her advisor said, excitement evident in her voice. Have you considered incorporating this into your final project? Not just the sketches, but perhaps interviews with others who were present. It could expand your exploration of how strangers intersect in public spaces to include moments of conflict and resolution. The suggestion resonated with Zoe, who had been considering similar possibilities since her exchange with Diane Chen. Yet she also felt uneasy about potentially exploiting a painful incident for artistic purposes, especially one with racial implications that she, as a white artist, might not fully understand or represent appropriately. I'd want to be careful about approach, she said cautiously. Make sure I'm not sensationalizing something painful or centering myself in someone else's story. Absolutely, her advisor agreed. That's exactly the kind of ethical consideration that separates thoughtful documentary work from exploitation. Think about it from a perspective of bearing witness rather than creating spectacle. And consider reaching out to the people directly involved. Getting their permission and perspectives could transform this from potential exploitation into collaborative storytelling. As Zoe contemplated this guidance, She realized that her artistic project was converging with larger questions of documentation, witness, and ethical representation that others connected to the incident were also navigating, creating yet another strand in the web of interconnection that had begun to form around the events on bus number 47. By evening, these various threads were drawing closer together, setting the stage for encounters that would further reveal the intricate connections between past and present, between individual actions and collective responsibility, between harm and the possibility of healing. Eleanor Jackson, having completed her hospital shift, sat in her modest home office reviewing a scanned copy of the police report from 37 years earlier, sent by a former colleague who now worked in records at the police department. The yellowed document confirmed what her memory had suggested. Frank Mercer had indeed been questioned as a potential witness in the harassment of her sister Josephine. His statement, brief and non-committal, claimed no knowledge of the incident despite his residence in the area. What the report couldn't tell her was whether Frank had been more than a witness, whether he had been one of the perpetrators who had vandalized Josephine's car and threatened her with worse. That knowledge, if it existed, resided only in Frank's conscience and perhaps in the memories of whoever had been with him that night. As Eleanor pondered this connection between past and present, her doorbell rang. Marcus Johnson stood on her porch, his expression a mixture of apprehension and resolve. "Thank you for seeing me without advance notice," he said as she invited him in. "There's something I need to tell you, something my uncle told me last night that I think you should know." Eleanor gestured for him to sit in her small living room, a space filled with books, family photographs, and mementos from a life richly lived. "I've been doing some research of my own today," she said, indicating the police report on the side table. "I remembered where I'd seen your uncle's name before." Marcus nodded, unsurprised. "As a witness in the case involving your sister." "Yes," Eleanor confirmed, "though I'm beginning to think he may have been more than that." "He was," Marcus said quietly. "He told me last night. He was one of the teenagers who harassed your sister and damaged her car." Though Eleanor had suspected as much, the confirmation still landed with emotional force. She was silent for a moment, absorbing the implications. "And yesterday on the bus, his reaction to me. He says he recognized you, not consciously at first, but something in him knew who you were," Marcus explained. "It doesn't excuse his behavior, not remotely, but he's finally acknowledging his part in both incidents." Eleanor nodded slowly, her expression thoughtful rather than angry. "Thank you for telling me, Marcus. I know that couldn't have been easy, given your relationship with him." "I'm still processing it myself," Marcus admitted, "and I'm torn about next steps. As a family member, I'm concerned about his mental state. He's drinking heavily, recently diagnosed with cancer, financially struggling. But as someone who cares about justice and about you," he trailed off, the conflict evident in his expression. "You're wondering if this information should be part of the Transit Authority investigation," Eleanor finished for him. "Yes," Marcus said, relieved that she understood. "My boss, Michael Reynolds, the board member who was on the bus, has asked to meet with me about new information. I need to decide what to tell him." Eleanor was quiet for a moment, weighing various considerations. Finally, she said, "I'd like to meet with your uncle." Marcus looked startled. "Meet with him? After what he did, both recently and all those years ago?" "Precisely because of those things," Eleanor said firmly. "This isn't just about a transit authority investigation or disciplinary action. It's about something deeper that's been unresolved for decades. I think it's time to address it directly." Her request, unexpected yet somehow fitting given everything that had transpired, set in motion the final convergence of paths that had been drawing closer since the confrontation on bus number 47. For while karma had indeed struck Frank Mercer in the form of professional consequences for his discriminatory behavior, its deeper work was just beginning, creating space for a reckoning that offered not just accountability, but the possibility of genuine transformation. The meeting was arranged for the following evening at Pastor Thomas Green's office in First Presbyterian Church, neutral ground that offered both privacy and a context of potential reconciliation. Frank Mercer, initially resistant when Marcus conveyed Eleanor's request, had finally agreed upon learning that she knew about his involvement in the harassment of her sister. Something in him recognized that this conversation was inevitable, perhaps had been for 37 years. As Alina entered the pastor's office, she found Frank already seated, tension evident in the rigid set of his shoulders. Marcus stood near the window, while Pastor Green sat behind his desk, his presence providing both structure and spiritual context for the difficult conversation to follow. "Thank you for coming, Frank," Alina said simply, taking the chair across from him. Frank couldn't meet her eyes. "Didn't have much choice, did I? Not if I want any chance of keeping my job." "Actually," Alina corrected gently, "this meeting isn't about your job. I've spoken with Michael Reynolds and asked that any information shared here be kept separate from the Transit Authority investigation. This is about something older and deeper than what happened on the bus yesterday." Frank looked up then, surprise momentarily overriding his defensive posture. "Why would you do that?" "Because some things are more important than professional consequences," Alina replied. "What you did to my sister 37 years ago and what you did to me on the bus are connected in ways that administrative discipline can't address. I think it's time we talked about that connection directly." What followed was a conversation unlike any that had occurred between the individuals present, a raw, honest excavation of past actions and their lingering impact. Frank, initially resistant, gradually shared more about that night long ago, how he and 4 friends, fueled by alcohol and the casual racism that permeated their social circle, had targeted Josephine simply because she was a black woman alone at night in what they considered their neighborhood. "I didn't throw the rock that broke her windshield," he said at one point, a last attempt at partial absolution. "But you were there," Alina responded, her voice firm but not unkind. "You participated, you threatened her, and then you lied to the police about it." Frank's shoulders slumped, the final defense crumbling. "Yes," he admitted, "I did all of that, and I spent decades telling myself it wasn't important, it was just teenage stupidity, no real harm done, until I saw you on my bus and something in me recognized you. And instead of facing that recognition, I tried to push you away to make you less visible by sending you to the back. It was shameful." There was no triumph in Alina's expression at this admission, only a profound sadness tinged with something like relief, the vindication of truth finally spoken aloud after decades of silence. "What happened to my sister that night changed her," Alina said quietly. "She left this city within a year, too afraid to stay. She gave up her nursing career, which she loved. The trauma stayed with her for years. That's the real impact of what you and your friends did, not just broken glass, but a broken sense of safety and belonging." Frank nodded, unable to speak, the full weight of consequences he had never considered finally registering. Marcus, who had been silent throughout this exchange, spoke up. "When I was growing up, you taught me that real men take responsibility for their actions. That principle seems to have gotten lost somewhere along the way." The pointed observation from his nephew struck Frank with particular force. "You're right," he acknowledged. "I've been a hypocrite, preaching accountability while hiding from my own. That stops now." He turned back to Alina. "I can't undo what I did, to Josephine or to you, but I'm truly sorry for both, and I'll accept whatever consequences come from that, professional or otherwise." Pastor Green, who had been a quiet witness to this exchange, finally spoke. "Acknowledging wrongdoing is the essential first step, but reconciliation also requires concrete action to address harm and prevent its recurrence. Frank, what are you prepared to do beyond expressing regret?" It was a challenging question, one that pushed beyond comfortable apology into the more demanding territory of restitution and change. Frank was silent for a long moment, considering. "I don't know yet," he admitted finally, "but I want to figure it out. Maybe I could speak to other drivers about bias, share my experience as a cautionary tale, or work with community groups on transit accessibility for minorities and seniors." He looked at Alina directly for the first time. Would you be willing to help me figure out how to make this right? Not that you owe me that," he added quickly. "You don't owe me anything." Alina studied him thoughtfully, measuring the sincerity of his words against his previous actions. "I believe in second chances," she said finally, "but they have to be earned through consistent action, not just good intentions. If you're serious about making amends, then yes, I'll help guide that process. Not for your sake, but for the community we both live in." It wasn't forgiveness, exactly. That would take more time and evidence of genuine change. But it was an opening, a possibility that the harm of the past might yet yield to healing in the present. And for everyone in that room, it represented a form of karma more profound than mere retribution, the opportunity for transformation that can emerge when truth is finally acknowledged and responsibility embraced. As the meeting concluded, Pastor Green offered a closing reflection. In many spiritual traditions, karma isn't just about punishment for wrongdoing. It's about the ripple effects of our actions coming back to teach us what we need to learn for our own growth. Sometimes, what looks like karma striking is actually karma healing, creating the conditions for a wound to finally be cleansed and begin to mend. Outside the church, as they prepared to go their separate ways, Marcus approached Alina. "Thank you," he said simply, "for your grace, for your wisdom, for showing me what true strength looks like." Alina smiled, the lines around her eyes deepening with genuine warmth. "Life is too short and too precious to carry unresolved harm, Marcus. What happened with your uncle, both in the past and on the bus, needed to be addressed. Now we can all move forward with truth rather than illusion as our foundation." As Alina made her way home under a sky bright with stars, she reflected on the strange journey that had begun with a confrontation on bus number 47. What had seemed initially like an isolated incident of discrimination had revealed itself as part of a much larger tapestry of interconnection. Past and present, harm and healing, individual choices and collective responsibility. Frank Mercer would face professional consequences for his actions on the bus. That process would continue through the transit authorities' investigation. But something more significant had also begun, a process of genuine reckoning and potential transformation that extended beyond administrative discipline into the deeper territory of human growth and community healing. As for the others whose lives had intersected on that fateful bus ride, Michael Reynolds, Diane Chen, Zoe Miller, Robert Wilson, Pastor Green, and the various passengers who had witnessed the confrontation, each had been changed in ways both subtle and profound by their participation in this unfolding story. New connections had formed, new understandings had emerged, new commitments to justice and compassion had been catalyzed. And perhaps that was karma's most meaningful expression, not the dramatic strike of immediate retribution, but the gradual, intricate weaving of consequence and opportunity, creating paths to redemption where none had seemed possible before. For in the end, true justice lies not merely in punishment for wrongdoing, but in the restoration of right relationship, with oneself, with others, and with the larger community of which we are all irreducibly a part. 3 months later, bus number 47 rolled to a stop on Maple Avenue, its brakes issuing the same tired squeal that had marked Alina Jackson's morning commute for years. As she climbed aboard, she was greeted not by Frank Mercer, who had transferred to a maintenance position after serving a suspension and completing sensitivity training, but by Shauna Williams, one of the few black women drivers at the depot. "Morning, Ms. Jackson," Shauna said warmly. "Beautiful day, isn't it?" "Indeed it is," Alina agreed, settling into a priority seat near the front. The bus was moderately full, its passengers a microcosm of the city's diversity. In the middle section, Diane Chen was grading papers, while near the back, Zoe Miller was finishing a sketch in her notebook. Neither woman knew that they were subjects in the other's work, Diane having incorporated the bus incident into a teaching module on contemporary civil rights issues. Zoe having developed her Intersections project into a well-received gallery exhibition on public transportation as a site of community formation and conflict resolution. As the bus continued its route, it passed First Presbyterian Church, where a newly installed community outreach center offered services ranging from health screenings to legal advice for underserved populations. Alina had been instrumental in its development, partnering with Pastor Green to create programming that addressed practical needs while building bridges across racial and generational divides. The Outreach Center had also become the site of a weekly dialogue group on bias and reconciliation, a group that included, among its regular participants, Frank Mercer, who was now working with the Transit Authority's Community Relations Department to improve driver training on diversity and inclusion. Frank's journey toward accountability and change had not been smooth or linear. There had been setbacks, moments of defensiveness and backsliding. But with Alina's firm guidance and his nephew Marcus's conditional support, he had begun the difficult work of examining his long-held biases and their impact on others. His cancer treatment had given him a new perspective on vulnerability and dependence, further softening the hard edges of his worldview. As for Marcus, he had recently been promoted to associate attorney at Reynolds and Associates, his handling of a complex discrimination case having impressed Michael with its nuanced understanding of both legal principles and human dynamics. The rift with his uncle remained a work in progress, but regular family dinners, sometimes including Alina as an honorary member, provided space for the slow rebuilding of trust and connection. The morning sun strengthened as bus number 47 continued its journey through the city, its passengers absorbed in their individual concerns, yet connected by the shared experience of public transit, that democratic space where lives briefly intersect before continuing on their separate paths. None of them could know the full extent of how their brief time together months earlier had rippled outward, catalyzing changes both personal and institutional that continued to unfold in ways both seen and unseen. But Alina, looking out at the passing cityscape with the wisdom of her 63 years, understood something essential about these connections, how moments of conflict, painful as they might be, sometimes created openings for truth and transformation that might otherwise remain closed. How karma worked not through simple punishment, but through the revelation of our profound interdependence. And how healing, when it came, required not just the passage of time, but the courage to face difficult truths and the commitment to create something better from their acknowledgement. As the bus approached her stop at Mercy General Hospital, where she now supervised a community nursing program as her legacy before full retirement, Alina gathered her belongings and made her way to the exit. Nodding thanks to Shauna, she descended to the sidewalk with the same quiet dignity that had sustained her through that confrontation 3 months earlier, a dignity neither given nor taken away by others' treatment, but maintained through her own unwavering sense of self-worth and purpose. The doors closed behind her, and bus number 47 continued on its route, carrying its temporary community of strangers forward into a day filled with possibilities yet unrevealed. A journey similar to countless others yet unique in its particular constellation of lives, momentarily united in the shared space of public transit and human connection. And somewhere in that intricate machinery of urban life, karma continued its subtle work, not as a force of vengeance or reward, but as the natural unfolding of cause and effect, action and consequence, harm and healing. For as Alina Jackson had come to understand through her long years of witnessing human struggle and resilience, we are all connected in ways both visible and invisible, our lives touching and transforming each other through encounters both momentous and mundane. In the end, perhaps the most profound truth revealed by that morning confrontation on bus number 47 was simply this: that in a world often divided by bias and misunderstanding, the path toward justice and reconciliation begins with the courage to remain seated in one's rightful place, and the wisdom to recognize when karma strikes not to destroy, but to illuminate the possibility of a more compassionate way forward.